Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. It all depends on where you happen to be around the world. This is JT Keating. I'm the Vice President of Product Strategy here at Zimperium, and I've had the fun, actually, and the pleasure of being able to run through our threat data for specific companies and specific industries over the last 5 or 6 weeks. And then what we're going to do today is actually come back and spend a little bit of time looking across those industries. So we've got the standard thing. We're going to try and keep this to under 30 minutes, including Q&A, which I don't think will be difficult to do. Usual routine, if you have any questions, put it in the Q&A section, and we'll get to them at the tail end of the session. Additionally, if we can't get to it, my email is jt.keating@zimperium.com. And if you have any questions or whatever the case may be afterwards, feel free to ping me. We are not using the chat capability because we have a little difficulty with it. So any questions you've got, make sure you put in the Q&A section. We will make the slides available, and there will be an archived recording that'll be up on the site, usually within a day or so. So with that, why don't we dive in and start talking about the summary analysis of the customer data across various industries. So as I mentioned, I've been going through this over the last few weeks. And the industries that we're pulling from, that we're going to be comparing here, are, we went through a legal firm, we've done energy, oil and gas firms, we've done 2 different financial services firms, a large city here in North America, a major consulting firm, global consulting firm, and then a major healthcare institution, a hospital to be specific. So what we're going to do is we're going to be spending a little bit of time talking about the similarities and some of the differences across these industries and the data that we've been going through. And again, if you want depth on each one, maybe you happen to be one of these verticals, you can go back and they're all archived and available for recording directly off of Zimperium.com. So, one of the things that we always kind of talk about is the fact that human beings have been the single biggest security risk for as long as there's been cybersecurity. And that has been the case when the users are inside of protected networks that we've spent billions of dollars on, with network firewalls, IDSs, IPSs, everything else, and on centrally managed endpoints with central antivirus, with patch management systems, all the rest of that kind of fun stuff. So imagine what happens when you have a mobile device, and with a mobile device, the user is the admin. The user is the one who decides. There is no patch management system. There is no centralized. They're outside of the network most of the time. The user's deciding what networks they're going to connect to, when they're going to update their phones, anything on those lines. And it spends the majority of time outside of the protected corporate network. There's still 3 time-tested security laws that apply to mobile, even though mobile is a new platform. One is land and expand. The simple fact is the bad guys will always find the weakest link in and then find a way into the organization. Right now, almost 2/3 of the devices accessing corporate networks are mobile, and they have no security on them for the most part and no visibility into them for the most part. Now, the advantage for the customers we're rolling through here is they have Zimperium on them, so they actually have protection and visibility. But for the majority of them, they don't. So the bad guys know to go there. Another time-tested security adage is customized attacks. You're going to have to defend against customized attacks, not attacks that everybody knows about. And then the third time-tested tradition is persistence. The bad guys are very good at what they do. Once they take over a device, they want to be able to remain persistent after reboots, when a person moves to a new network, everything like that. And as we'll be talking about, the only really good way to do that on mobile is by actually compromising the device. So before we dive into the data, let's frame it up with kind of what the attackers are after, and then what are the major attack buckets, and then we'll dive straight into the data. So what are the attackers after? We know the big 3. They're either trying to steal credentials, which they can then use and leverage to do additional penetration. They're after the data itself, maybe in the case of cardholder data, patient data, IP, whatever the case may be. And then ultimately, again, they want to land and expand. In order to do that, weaponizing any given endpoint is a key. So that's the same thing with mobile. If I take over this device because it's handled by an admin or a user, because it's outside of the networks, whatever, I want to weaponize it. I want to make myself persistent where I can continue to move inland from there. And by the way, if you want a really interesting case study on all this, we did a webinar with a really talented penetration tester from Italy a couple of weeks ago, and they had written a paper about going after the golden ticket with just an Android phone. And it's a great webinar that, and there's a white paper associated with it you can download again from our site. So that's what these guys are after. On mobile, how do they actually go about doing it? Well, there's 4 big buckets, and we're going to be talking about 3 of them predominantly here today. But the 3 big buckets are malicious apps. Now, one of the biggest differences in mobile compared to traditional is apps are all in containers. That means apps can't play with other apps. For those of us that come from the traditional endpoint protection world, we're used to a piece of malware coming in and being able to move sideways into other apps as it continues to expand. You can't do that in mobile. Apps can't play with other apps. So the only way that an app can actually cause some problems is by getting out of its container and in some way, shape, or form compromising the device, which I'll get to in a second. But malicious apps by themselves are really untargeted and designed for fraud. It's really predominantly a consumer problem, not an enterprise problem. Phishing is similar. It's untargeted. It can deliver exploits. Both of them can, but again, it's just untargeted. It's not necessarily a good strategy for going after people initially, right? Now, Verizon pointed out the last year that 90% of the breaches started with some form of phishing or spear phishing attack. 2/3 of the devices or emails are read on mobile devices. So we do want to address phishing. We have to address phishing. But these first two, the first two are untargeted, and if nothing else, the bad guys are very good at what they do, and they have a very efficient business model. If they're going to target XYZ law firm, XYZ consulting firm, XYZ bank, XYZ whatever that we're going through, utility here in a minute, what they're going to do is they're going to start with a network attack, because they can put up a fake network and they can sit right across from the offices of any of those companies, and they can wait until they find somebody that actually works at those companies and then exploit the device and elevate privileges. And the sole objective for being persistent are these device exploits, rogue access, rogue profiles, malicious profiles, root access. Those kind of compromises are the key objective, because that's the only way you're above the containers, and it can actually have power outside of the app that you came in on if you're thinking about the app side. So the primary delivery mechanism is a network attack and a targeted approach, because we are designed to protect the enterprise. So all the data we're about to go through is all about enterprises being protected. And the objective is to deliver a device exploit. There'd be no reason to deliver a malicious app that would then have to do something else, compromise the device. So how does Zimperium help? I'm going to go through literally 3 slides real quick on the product, because it helps set up the data and it'll provide some context. Z9 is our one engine. We have a machine learning based engine that is trained in the cloud against tens of millions of mobile devices around the world and billions of data points. Once it's trained to be able to detect device, network phishing, and malicious app attacks, and it knows what to look for, those, what we call classifiers, are put down on the device itself. Now, because the bad guys use network attacks, and the data is going to show you this, because they use network attacks, we have always fundamentally believed, since our job is to protect the enterprise, unlike some folks who started in the consumer market and are trying to get into the enterprise, we've always thought about the enterprise. And so we've said the bad guys are going to control the network. And so in order to defend yourself, you have to be able to do all of your detection on device. So we train in the lab, we detect on device, so we can actually defend ourselves against things like network attacks. Z9 can be rolled out in one of 2 ways. It can either be rolled out as a product called Zips, or we have partnerships with guys like McAfee, Mobile Iron, where it's under their brand of telcos around the world, Deutsche Telekom, Telstra, all the rest of them. It can be rolled out, and if you're trying to protect the device and all the data and access of that device, let's say corporate devices, you would use Zips. It is basically next generation antivirus for mobile, if you will. So that is the Zips use case. We can also take the exact same engine though, and we have an SDK, software development kit, called ZApp for in-app protection, where you can take the exact same engine, you can drop it into any mobile app. In that case, you're not trying to protect the device, you're trying to protect the app and the sessions that that app is having. So for instance, we have a major financial services institution, a big bank, that is using Zips to protect a couple 100,000 employees, and they're using ZApp to protect over 25 million mobile banking users. Very different use case, very different scenarios. Zips running 100% of the time will detect the first part of the kill chain, which is hugely critical when we get into the data we're about to look at. ZApp will only be awake when that session of that app is there. And so it's actually the data from a research standpoint that comes back is more pure from the ZApp standpoint, because it is in a completely, it's not stopping anything initially, it's assessing what's going on and then deciding what that app wants to do with it. And I'll give you an example of why that matters later. Either one of these comes directly into our console, which is called Z Console. Because we're doing all our detection on device, and because we know that the enterprises have different things that they like, enjoy, or that they've standardized on, we're the only ones who can do, completely cloud agnostic. We don't care where you put the console. The guys that are doing cloud-based detection are locked into one solution only. We don't believe that you should do that. You should be able to have your choice. Behind Z Console is a capability called Z3A. That stands for Advanced App Analysis. These are risky apps. The malicious apps are being detected by Z9, but there's a whole bunch of, since mobile apps are basically put together with Legos, when the developers are putting those things together, sometimes they'll put in a certain library or certain Lego in their hurry that might create privacy and security risks. So even though the app is legit, it could still be dangerous to your enterprise. And identifying those reputations is a key component. Behind Z Console, we integrate in with the broadest set of EMMs. We're also the only ones who can handle multiple EMMs in the same console. And we've actually taken our agent and put it inside some of these folks, Mobile Iron being the first one. And then all the data can go into your SIMs, your McAfee EPO, things on those lines. So, end of product. The reason I explain it is that the data that we're going through here is all Zips related data. And what that means is Zips is running 100% of the time on those devices. So what they're going to do is Zips is going to be detecting the first parts of the kill chain first, by definition. As soon as they come up with that, they're going to kill the entire kill chain right then and there. So I mentioned we've always known that for a targeted attack against an enterprise, the network was going to be the primary delivery mechanism. So not surprisingly, with our Zips data, the network attacks are by far the largest number of attacks that we detect across all of these. When we talk about the ZApp scenario with the bank, for instance, in the pure wide open data set that 25 million folks are hanging out with, it's roughly 80% device attacks, 12% network attacks, and 8% malicious apps. That's because there was nothing to proactively stop a device compromise. And the device compromise needed to occur, whether it's consumer or an enterprise side, in order for the attacker to have any capabilities beyond that app. So the great, kind of untainted world is roughly 80% device compromise, 12% network, and 8% malicious apps. The data I'm about to show you, again, in the Zips case, we're not trying to do pure research. In the Zips case, it is along the kill chain line, so you're going to be seeing that. So first thing we always do is we always break up risk versus threats, okay? A risk is you've made yourself inherently more exposed. A threat is you're actively under attack, okay? So what was the average number of risks and threats to devices across our initial sample set? 50, a little over 50 risks and threats on every device across our industries. Now, what I always think is really interesting is looking at the industries themselves and saying, okay, what can we learn from this? And part of it for me, as a, kind of for my research part of my job, part of it is looking at the industries, but part of it is also looking at, okay, if some of these guys are inherently more risky, are they experiencing more attacks? And things on those lines, right? Is there a difference, in some of these? So what's interesting here is across industries, it was 50, and you can clearly see the ones that are the most interesting to me are the investment management firm and the consulting firm. And again, we're going to go into like what actually makes up each one of these, right? The city government is interesting to me because it's so low. And we'll go into that a little bit, and we'll dive into it a little bit. But it could also be a function of a few things in terms of even how long these each one of these things have been implemented. And then the energy one is interesting to me personally because it's critical infrastructure, and there's some different ramifications to it. So what was the mix of total risk? Like I said, we do risk first, and then we do threats. Now, when it comes to the risk, you're making yourself inherently more exposed because not every one of the industries that we surveyed were using the Z3A capability of risky apps that have privacy and security risks. We have not actually included that in the data. It just got too muddled. So for the risks, it's really device and network between the two of them. So the mix between them across industries, 83% of them were in terms of the attacks or the risks that we detected were network based. And I'm going to go into what each one of those are. 17% were device between the two. So what do we notice that's pretty interesting? Well, I mean, obviously the city government is still fascinating to me, right? Because it's the one that shifts the entire thing. 84% of the risk that they experienced were device related risks as opposed to network related. So when we get into it, that's going to be something we're going to be kind of looking at. Some of the other ones I think that are pretty interesting. If you look at the consulting and if you look at healthcare, I know those specifically, very low number of device risk. And that's because they've been customers for quite some time, and their ability to detect the risks of devices and act upon them using MDMs and the like, they've been able to really clean up that part of it. But the people are still surfing in and out of potentially dangerous networks. So that's kind of where you end up with some of these interesting splits. So what were the network risks? Well, there's really two big buckets, and we've taken a lot of multiple, kind of random things, or not random, the more granular things, and rolled them up for some of this reporting because otherwise it gets really ugly. So basically two big buckets. Unsecured Wi-Fi, these are Wi-Fis that have no password, these are Wi-Fis that are not encrypted, things like that. And then a captive portal. We've all seen captive portals. That's when you go into Starbucks, the Admirals Club or whatever, or the airport, and there's a little web page that pops up and it says, would you like to access this, blah, 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 blah. There are some captive portals that are perfectly fine, but as I mentioned in the phishing example earlier, the minute your device processes a web page, an exploit can be delivered. So a captive portal could literally be a delivery mechanism with no network behind it at all. Is it an attack? Not necessarily, but does it make you inherently more risky the more of these that you have exposed yourself to? Absolutely. So, but it's roughly 50-50. And if you look at the majority of the industries, it still kind of follows along those lines, back and forth a little bit. Some of the ones that, are pretty interesting is, again, coming back to the city government, a huge chunk of the networks these guys are on are just completely insecure, right? Whereas if you turn around and look at, healthcare or the investment management guys, obviously their people are getting on brand new networks all the time with a significant number of captive portals. And then what we do with each one of these, with each customer, we decide how much of a risk do you think this is? Do you notify a user or not? And then kind of go from there. What about the device side? So on average, And we have a pretty significant penetration of iOS, and particularly in this data set that we definitely did. So 70s, two-thirds of the device risk across all the industries were vulnerable iOS. And if you actually layer in iOS, vulnerable operating system of iOS, vulnerable Android, and vulnerable not upgradable on here, you're talking about like 85%. So by the way, vulnerable Android not upgradable, because the upgrade process in Android is significantly more cumbersome than on iOS. On iOS, Apple makes their own phones. When they get a patch, they can get their patch directly out to their phones because they have the relationship with carriers, and you can push it out. And then in most cases, unless people have set up auto update, it still requires the user, who's the admin, to update it, which is why 76% of them, of the risk, device risk, were guys that just haven't done that, right? On the Android side, the Google produces a patch. It has to get it to every handset manufacturer. Every handset manufacturer has to create their own patch and then get it out to the carriers. So one of the things we built in was, which is helping, again, it shows our enterprise mindset, is helping the admins by saying, okay, here are some vulnerable Android phones to new vulnerabilities that are out that are not upgradable yet. So there's no reason to notify the user, and there's no reason to keep notifying the admin other than reporting, because you can't do anything about it yet. But it's still vulnerable. The other things I think are pretty interesting. Well, first on that, the consulting in healthcare, I mentioned that only 2% of theirs devices, 2% of total risk was device risk. So even though those numbers are high in terms of 93 and 99 here, in terms of vulnerable, their set is much smaller. So just for what that's worth. The other ones that hop out at me, which I think are pretty interesting, the energy one really does. It's fascinating to me. We're talking about critical infrastructure. And by the way, this is data, and we've already worked with our customers. And so, a lot of these things have been fixed, and also have an evolution of the customers. Like I said, how long have they had the product, and how long is the maturity? But before this, you can see that simple security wasn't being implemented yet. Almost a third didn't have a PIN set, and 25% didn't have encryption. And the developer options, the USB debugging is just another capability where you're actually able to, it's almost like a developer option, and it opens up a little bit more of the platform, a little bit more of the window to cause some problems. So pretty interesting stuff, if you ask me. What about threats? Let's move from risk over to threats, right? Well, what's the mix? Across the scope, again, 97% are network attacks, 2% are malicious apps, and 1% are device compromises. Now, again, I go back to the point. When it comes to zips, Zimperium is not doing this in a vacuum for research purposes. We're actually protecting our customers in the first places that they get hit. The first place they get hit, Z9 will detect where that attack is. So the fact is, we're detecting all these network attacks, which means they can't deliver the exploit to the device. Or we're detecting malicious apps, even if they are untargeted, and they can't deliver exploits to the device. So 97, 1, 2 is the standard. And I apologize for not matching all the colors up. But you can see that, kind of across the board, the network part still seems to be, the predominant piece of the whole thing, right? Then you shift over to the apps, and you're like, okay, which ones are kind of interesting? Well, the public pension fund is really interesting from the percentage of threats that are malicious app, and the fact that there was almost no device compromise. That's pretty interesting. The other one I think is really interesting is if you kind of look at this, with the exception of the public pension fund, 1% of every single one of these guys were device compromises. And so I think that's pretty interesting as we dive into what's going on. So what were the network threats? Well, there's, again, for roll-up purposes, we put a few of these things together. There's man-in-the-middle attacks, which basically the hacker has found a way of actually inserting themselves in the middle of this, and can be using, stealing data directly or anything on those lines. there's a kind of a variation of that, but is all these changes in handoffs. This is where, whether it's DNS or gateway or network handoffs, proxy changes, they will redirect you places you don't realize you're going, most likely. Then there's scans, and scans is debatable as to whether it should be a threat or a risk. It's in here as a threat because it's pretty likely that if somebody's scanning devices, they're looking for something. And that means it's going to lead into, it's a precursor to an actual attack. And then rogue access points are straight up fake Wi-Fi networks. One of the dumbest things about smartphones is the phone is the one that will actually, every single time it meets a new network, it will literally say, hey, are you, and it goes through its entire list of every network that, every Wi-Fi network it's ever talked to. And it's up to the network to say yes or no. So all the bad networks do is say yes, and then they're connected. So on average, almost 60% are MIDMs. 60% are attacks where they're stealing data straight up, they're stripping SSL off, they're doing things on those lines. 28% are changes, 10% scams, and 4% rogue access points. Again, in orange, I've put out some of the ones that I think are pretty interesting. The fact that the global investment firm and the healthcare firm have experienced a significantly higher than average number of MIDM attacks is pretty interesting. Now, what we do with that and how we, is there anything different? Are these people coming, are they in the same places? That's the next kind of secondary thing that we do with our customers. We move down to the come in. And sorry, my little thing just said that my internet connection was unstable. I feel like I'm unstable, but that's a different subject altogether. So these guys are in some interesting networks, and we've got to figure out where those networks are to make sure that we can proactively warn people to stay away from them. Energy and the city government are also the ones that are getting scanned. Not a surprise, because people are trying to find those guys. So they're probably in places that they want it. And then rogue access points, it's pretty interesting. If you take out that 18% of the public pension fund, which I'm about to come back to, pretty traditionally, it's closer to a 1% number than it is a 4% number. Very dangerous though, because they straight up control the network in that case. With the public pension fund, we dive into those and figure out exactly where each one of those rogue access points are, and spend some time investigating and trying to figure out who's doing it, but then also really warning our customers about not going there. Device threats. Like I said, this is the holy grail. Compromising a device and elevating privileges in some way, shape, or form is the holy grail. This is the objective in order to be persistent and in order to be able to really wreak havoc across that. And again, you can see, from an average standpoint, the system tampering and suspicious profiles are the majority of them, right? Jailbreaking and rooting are extremely dangerous, and when we have it in our category, it's really mostly rooting. Jailbreak is something that users do. Rooting is something that a bad guy does. And by rooting, it means basically getting root access on those devices. And starting there at the bottom, because I think it's pretty interesting, because if you have root access, you have more control over that device than the owner of the device does, way more. The major consulting firm and the critical infrastructure were the guys that were way above the norm on those categories. Those are people that really need to be protected. Now, an interesting note on the consulting firm side is the consulting firm, when they first started with us, they actually had a significant suspicious profile problem. And again, a suspicious profile is a configuration change on Apple that you can actually elevate privileges, and it's intended for legitimate purposes like an MDM or a VPN. But if you can put a suspicious or a malicious profile on a device, then you've got privileges above and beyond the containers, right? So last year, these numbers would have been very different for the consulting firm. The fact that the suspicious profile is at 0 for them is a huge thing. Now they're having to deal with other attacks. Now they're being protected by Z9, so that's good. But it also means the devices, for instance, maybe that haven't gotten Z9 on it yet, need to be protected against either one of those buckets. The global investment management, again, it makes total sense. Heavy iOS shop, and just via social engineering, you can trick people into installing these profiles and get them on there, and then you've got complete access, very similar to the healthcare example. And then the system tampering side is, again, where they're actually playing around with abnormal processes and things like that. And the legal and the city government, that's the primary thing that they needed to worry about. And then finally, what about the app threats, right? Well, two big buckets we put in is suspicious Android app and unknown sources download config change, basically changing things around so that you can actually download from other places, or you're downloading from sources that are not really known, trusted, respected, et cetera. The reality is Android does have more of a malware problem than iOS. Apple does a very good job of vetting in the App Store. They vet not only the app, but they vet the developer. Google actually does a much better job than they get credit for in the Play Store. The problem is, in the Android world, third-party app stores are everywhere, they're prevalent, and they're heavily used. That's where the majority of the suspicious, malicious apps come from on the Android side. So if we look at the folks, and again, look for things that are kind of interesting, to me, the consulting firm and the energy, the ones we were just talking about a few minutes ago on the system tampering, I don't think it's shocking that that there's more malware there, more suspicious malware that can lead to other things. Even if it isn't targeted, it can still lead to other things. So I think that's management, who we were just talking about again just a few minutes ago, the unknown sources config change, they're actually setting themselves up. And I totally apologize. I just realized that the gray of the suspicious on my little bubble is the opposite on the chart. So sorry for that confusion. But for healthcare and for the global investment management firm, there's all sorts of these unknown sources and config change attempts, which can lead to device compromises. But the bottom line is this, from my standpoint, 100% of Zimperium's customers experience attacks. The only questions are, which ones are they experiencing? So you need to be able to have a solution that actually detects across the entire spectrum, and it needs to be machine learning because many of these things are things that have never been seen before, and it needs to be on device because otherwise the bad guys can cut you off, because as you've seen, the majority of these attacks have started with bad networks. Brief comment about mobile compliance. We have a whole bunch of customers that have bought our mobile solutions because of compliance mandates. Punchline behind this whole thing, we've got an entire page on compliance. You can go check out HIPAA, PCI, GDPR, NERC. I mean, take all the rest, various different ones. Simple thing is, an endpoint is an endpoint is an endpoint. If you have patient data sitting on a server or a laptop, it's no different than that exact same patient data sitting on a tablet. So if you have compliance mandates that you've got to meet, these devices are something that need to be considered as well. So with that, I am going to stop and see if we have any questions. And if not, then I will let you guys go. And again, the slides will be up here. We'll make slides available, and the recording will be made available as well. So let's see if we have any questions. Does not appear we have any questions. So with that, I would just like to thank everybody for their time. And again, if you have any questions after the fact, jt.keating@zimperium.com. Thank you very much. Have a great day.